All right, welcome back to another very special Dr. J Radio Live, not quite radio show because we are doing live video, not from La La Land or Hollywood, but from the Big Island in Hawaii with, of course, my dear friend, Dr. Michael Salla, PhD. Dr. Salla, it's a pleasure to finally be in your own home turf, dear friend.
Thank you.
Okay,
thank you.
So first we had these ET craft that were released by the DoD, if you recall, a couple years ago, and they had characteristics that were not aerodynamic, that they said violated the laws of physics, and even the pilots that were watching them were saying, what's this? Two separate videos. Many people look at that as contact. That's already done because we're never going to get a presidential speech about it. What do you think about that?
Right, the Tic Tac cases where the Navy pilots from the aircraft carrier saw these objects that were flying out of the ocean or near the ocean and then flying very quickly out into space. And, you know, people look at that and they think, well, now that's pretty clear evidence that we're being visited by extraterrestrial life. And because I think the craft themselves, you know, the capabilities of them are such that, you know, the conventional aircraft propulsion systems that people are knowledgeable about, that, you know, these are not propelled by them. They're using some other propulsion systems because of the really rapid acceleration and the high G forces that would be required, that you would need to have something that has some kind of inertialess drive, for example. So this is a sign of very advanced technology that most people assume would be extraterrestrial, but I believe that the US military, the Air Force and the Navy have for decades been developing their own anti-gravity craft where they've been able to master these kinds of propulsion systems, and so now they can actually replicate a lot of the kind of advanced flight performance of extraterrestrial craft. So you really can't tell the difference. So the craft that the Navy pilots photographed back in 2004, we don't know if they are extraterrestrial or they could be Navy or aircraft.
Like Greer says, ARV, alien reproduction vehicles. So some people like Bob Lazar, when he worked at S4, known as Section 4 as well, Area 51 and Papoose Dry Lake Bed, says that he was working on figuring out how to reverse engineer the craft and to create their artificial gravity waves. Others said that we perfected this in the 50s. What do you think? It was the 50s, or was it still being worked on during the Lazar years?
I think that the development of these craft really began in the 50s when they got their hands on these alien craft that had crashed. In the 1940s there were several incidents. Of course the Second World War happened and they needed time to be able to get a serious study going on these retrieved alien craft. But by the 50s they were full bore studying them, and the 60s they began putting out their first prototypes. And so as they were putting out their prototypes, testing them, training their pilots, because there was different instrumentation, because there was some kind of mind technology interface that was required. And by the 70s, they start to actually begin developing some of the operational craft for flying off into space, mainly near Earth orbit to begin with, as far as the Air Force was concerned. The Navy was always more interested in doing deep space work, and so there was a bifurcation between what the Navy was doing and what the Air Force was doing. But yeah, all of that really took off in the 70s and 80s, and by the 80s, the Air Force have their own flying saucers, their own flying triangles. They got stealth space stations up there. And the Navy was developing their own cigar-shaped craft that could go out into deep space.
Now, we do know that if we can create an artificial gravity wave, then by default, we're creating a machine or a wave that's able to bend the time-space continuum or create a wormhole or a stargate. So this comes to the next question about the Mandela effect. A lot of people are claiming that things were one way and are now another way. Berenstain Bears is one of the several different types of what people say have changed. Is this something being used against us? Why such subtle things? And if new dimensions are being created under our noses, how do we even remember the past dimension?
Really interesting is when you start using these really advanced technologies that are able to warp space-time for being able to travel out into space using these anti-gravity vehicles, or developing things like warp drive for craft that can travel even interstellar distances. You know, you're warping space-time, and that brings in this question of time travel. Well, what does this mean for time travel? I think this is one of the projects that has been secretly conducted. In the 1970s, you had the Montauk project from 1971 to 1983. That was conducted out of Montauk Air Station. And that's when they began the first time travel experiments. They were using children, young boys, to pioneer these technologies. They were very dangerous to begin with, so they were using street kids and testing these technologies on the street kids to see how they could alter the timeline, or to see if they could use these time travel technologies to be able to bring about outcomes that were suitable to them. Now, so this is what's been happening in these compartmentalized programs since the 1970s. I think this is something that the deep state has been developing ever since, that they've perfected a lot of these technologies, and they're using it to manipulate the timeline to produce an outcome that is suitable to their long-term agenda. And I think the Mandela effect is a very concrete sign that this is going on. Like you mentioned the Bernstein Bears. You know, of course, most people are very familiar with Nelson Mandela. Some people remember him dying in prison. Others say, well, you know, others know that he became president of South Africa. Very recently, Scientific America versus Scientific American. Just like, and I think all of these are signs that there are efforts to manipulate the timeline to stop us heading down a certain track, or to take us down a certain track. And I became very familiar with this from hearing the testimony of Alex Collier, who first began in 1991 talking about the timeline being shifted, and that he was saying that the Andromedan Council were here, and they said that they were very concerned because a timeline had been created where 700 years into our future, a galactic tyranny would be created. And this timeline was being manipulated so that it would become the dominant timeline in our galaxy. And the Andromedans were here to basically find out who was behind the creation of this timeline. And they traced it back to this three planets, to now the Earth, Moon and Mars, that this galactic tyranny that would be taking off 700 years in the future in another timeline that was threatening to spread and become the dominant timeline, that was traced to now.
So a couple more things. You said three locations: Earth, Moon, Mars. Are you suggesting right now that the Moon and Mars is still inhabited? Because artifacts, some people are saying it's clear as day, they're there. Even a Neil Armstrong footage shows something in the background. If he's the first person on the moon, then who put that pole up in the back? There's just so many anomalies on the moon and Mars.
There's bases on the moon and Mars that date back millennia to the original inhabitants. On the moon, especially on the far side of the moon, there are multiple extraterrestrial bases there. The moon is for extraterrestrials like Antarctica is for national governments on Earth. It's a place for peaceful scientific research. So the far side of the moon is a great place for extraterrestrials to come, establish a colony, establish bases, and study the Earth. Because the Earth for extraterrestrials is where all the action is. You know, we have such a rich biodiversity here, and extraterrestrials are really fascinated by what's going in here, the different genetics that are here, and the different kind of experiments that are being undertaken here. So the moon for them is a great place to study all of this. Now, one of the extraterrestrial races that is there are called the Draconians. Mars. This is a
Okay.
very powerful reptilian race, and this is the race that the Andromedans said were behind this galactic tyranny that would be established 700 years into the future. And so this is where we get into the moon being a key part of this, and
Okay.
also Mars, because a similar thing happening on Mars, because Mars is where these different transnational corporations have set up secret bases underneath the surface of Mars, where there are millions of people. You remember the brain drain from the 60s and 70s?
Yes.
Millions of very talented scientists, engineers, doctors, researchers were taken to Mars to basically to establish this this transnational corporate colony on Mars, and that's been helped by these draconian extraterrestrials since the 60s and the 70s.
And they don't have our best interest at heart, the Draconians, the reptilians.
They're into empire building. But the
Okay.
thing to keep in mind is that, you know, when we think of empire building, we think, oh, okay, technologies, conquering worlds. That's not quite how it happens in the galaxy. Empire building is not so much conquering planets and races through kind of territorial battles and space battles. You know, that's a big part of it, but it's also through manipulating the timelines. This is what the Draconians were doing in the 1990s. Alex Collier was the first to report on that, and Corey Good has been talking about that very recently as well. That really we need to understand what's going on, not as a kind of territorial battle, but as a temporal battle. That this is a battle over timelines, and he's talking pretty much the same thing. That the Draconians and the Dark Fleet, they're trying to establish this timeline where there's going to be this galactic tyranny that's established, one where any kind of positive extraterrestrial groups are going to be conquered by these Draconians and their allies, such as the German Dark Fleet and so forth. And what's interesting is that, you know, this is what Alex Collier was saying 20 years ago, and Corey Good is saying the same thing now.
Final topic. Okay, so over 70 years ago, we theorized there's black holes. Then we realized the scientific community is that they must exist at the center of every galaxy. Finally, we have the first image of a black hole. And we've been talking about the Space Force really a lot in the last 2 years. What do you think is going to happen?
Well, when we're talking about black holes, we're talking about wormholes that are connecting black holes.
Einstein-Rosen bridges.
That's the key here, is because many people understand that the Einstein-Rosen bridge is this theoretical construct that Albert Einstein was discussing way back in the 20s and 30s with some of his colleagues, and basically that there's this connection between black holes that a wormhole achieves, and if you can find a way to keep this open, later scientists began talking about how you could do this through the use of exotic matter. Kip Thorne is a Caltech physicist, and he began talking about how you could have these traversable wormholes built or kept open, connecting black holes. So this, I think, is part of the rollout, because I think what the Air Force has been secretly doing is not just building these spacecraft, you know, triangles, flying saucers and rectangles and stealth space stations. They also have stargates. Like the whole Stargate SG-1, it was soft disclosure. They really do have one of these things, and some of the two Air Force chiefs of staff actually went to the Stargate studio and were filmed. There was Michael Ryan and also General Jumper. These were guys that were part of the Stargate SG-1. They were two serving Air Force chiefs of staff, and they were there. So I think this is part of the rollout. And so I think that they're kind of letting us know about black holes, that they exist, because they're wanting to let us know soon that wormholes exist, they're real, and that the Air Force has been running a wormhole program for decades. And that Stargate SG-1 was the Air Force basically doing soft disclosure.
So they're trying to acclimate us, essentially.
Totally.
Well
totally.
said. Well, Dr. Salla, pleasure to be on your island. Everybody out there, Watch for more live streams straight from here in Hawaii.